I remember it like it was yesterday. I was 16 and finally trusted to stay home alone for an entire weekend while my parents attended a wedding out of town. It felt like a rite of passage, my first taste of independence. I assured them I'd be fine, after all. Nothing exciting ever happened in our quiet suburban neighborhood. The first night started uneventfully. I made some popcorn, binge watched a few episodes of a show, and fell asleep on the couch. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something faint. I thought it might have been the wind brushing against the window or maybe the old house settling, but it sounded oddly like whispering. Groggy and a bit disoriented, I strained my ears, but it stopped. Shrugging it off, I went upstairs to my bedroom and fell back asleep. The next day passed without incident. I cleaned up, played some video games, and called a friend to kill time. By nightfall, though, the house felt different. It was an odd sensation, like the air was heavier. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Still, I double-checked the locks before heading to bed. I woke up again in the middle of the night, this time to the unmistakable sound of whispering. It wasn't faint anymore. It was clear, distinct, and seemed to come from downstairs. My heart raced as I lay frozen in bed, listening. The words were unintelligible, like multiple voices murmuring at once. Gathering my courage, I tiptoed out of my room and peered down the staircase. The living room was bathed in the pale glow of the moonlight streaming through the windows. Nothing seemed out of place, but the whispers persisted. I wanted to believe it was the TV. Maybe I'd forgotten to turn it off. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I realized the TV wasn't on. The whispers were coming from the far corner of the living room, where the shadows seemed unnaturally thick. My throat tightened, and a cold sweat ran down my back. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The whisper stopped instantly, leaving the house eerily silent. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. When nothing did, I convinced myself it was my imagination and hurried back upstairs. Still, I locked my bedroom door before crawling under the covers. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the wall in the living room, there were scratches, long, jagged marks that hadn't been there the day before. They were faint, like someone had lightly dragged their nails across the surface. I stared at them for a long time, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it had been there all along, and I'd just never noticed. Maybe. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I stayed up late, trying to distract myself with videos on my laptop. Around 1 a.m., the whispers started again. This time, they weren't coming from downstairs. They were just outside my bedroom door. I froze, staring at the door handle. It jiggled lightly as though someone were testing the lock. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure whoever, or whatever, was out there could hear it. I reached for my phone to call someone, but my hands were shaking so badly, I dropped it on the floor. The sound was deafening in the silence, and the whisper stopped again. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, clutching my phone, too afraid to move. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found another set of scratches, this time on my bedroom. They were deeper than the ones downstairs, as though something with sharp claws had tried to get in. I called my parents, trying to sound casual. As I asked when they'd be home, my mom laughed and said they'd be back the next evening. I didn't tell her what was happening. What could I say? That I was scared of whispers and scratches? That final night was the worst. I stayed in my room, keeping every light on and the door locked. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to my cat. My breathing hitched as they stopped right outside my door. This time, the whispers were louder, clearer. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was malicious, angry. The doorknob rattled violently, and the door shook as though someone was trying to break it down. I screamed, grabbing the closest thing to a weapon I had, a pair of scissors, and backed into the corner of my room. Suddenly, everything stopped. No footsteps, no whispers, no rattling. The silence was deafening. I sat there, trembling, until the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window. When my parents came home that afternoon, I didn't say anything. What was there to say? They wouldn't believe me. But as they unpacked their bags, my mom paused, staring at the living room wall. "What happened here?" she asked, pointing to the scratches. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My dad frowned, kneeling to inspect the marks. "They weren't here before we left," he said, glancing at me. I shrugged, feigning ignorance. But inside, I was screaming. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but wonder, whatever it was, had it really left? Or was it still there, watching and waiting? The night started like any other. My friend Rachel had asked me to dog sit for her while she went on a weekend getaway. Her house was a charming, modern place in a quiet suburb, the kind of neighborhood where people left their doors unlocked. I agreed without hesitation. Her golden retriever, Max, was a sweetheart, and I figured it'd be an easy gig. Rachel's house was spotless, almost too perfect, the kind of place where even the couch cushions were perfectly aligned. After she left, I settled in, letting Max curl up next to me on the couch while I watched TV. By the time it hit 10 p.m., the house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and Max's steady breathing. I had just started dozing off when Max suddenly lifted his head, his ears perking up. His gaze was fixed on the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. I followed his eyes, but all I saw was darkness. The backyard light was off, and the glass reflected the living room back at me. "Relax, boy," I said, patting his head. But Max didn't relax. He growled, a low, guttural sound I'd never heard from him. My stomach tightened as I glanced back at the glass door. I saw it. A man. He stood just beyond the door, barely illuminated by the faint moonlight. His face was pale, his features sharp, and he was staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat. He didn't move, didn't knock, didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. Something about him felt wrong. He wasn't a disheveled stranger looking for help. His clothes were clean, his posture upright, but his presence felt off, like he didn't belong. Max barked furiously now, standing between me and the door. Finally, I forced myself to grab my phone from the coffee table. My hands trembled as I dialed Rachel's number. No answer. I tried again and again, but she didn't pick up. When I finally looked back at the door, the man was gone. I locked the sliding door, double-checking it twice before turning off the lights and heading upstairs to the guest bedroom. Max followed me, his tail tucked between his legs. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just a neighbor passing through the yard. But the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made me jump, and Max growled at the slightest noise. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, but when I peeked out of the bedroom, it was empty. Still, I locked the door before crawling back under the covers. The next day, I tried to shake off the fear. It had to have been a harmless misunderstanding. I even convinced myself I'd imagined some of it. I spent the day with Max, taking him for a walk and trying to distract myself with movies. By the time night fell again, I was feeling slightly better. But deep down, I dreaded the silence that came with the night. At around midnight, Max started growling again. This time, it was louder, more urgent. My heart pounded as I realized the sound was coming from the backyard again. Slowly, I crept down the stairs, Max at my heels. The sliding glass door was fogged up from the cool night air, but as I approached, I saw it. Handprints on the outside of the... I froze. The handprints were fresh, sliding slightly, though whoever had made them was still there. I grabbed the curtain and yanked it shut, my breathing ragged. I didn't want to know if he was standing there again. I ran back upstairs and locked myself in the guest bedroom. I called the police this time, whispering into the phone so whoever was outside wouldn't hear me. They told me they'd send someone over and advised me to stay locked inside. I sat on the floor, clutching Max, who was still growling softly. It felt like hours before I heard the knock at the front door. A voice called out, identifying themselves as the police. I hurried down, heart hammering, and unlocked the door. 2 officers stood there, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "We checked the perimeter," one of them said. "No one's out there now. Are you sure you saw someone?" I led them to the sliding glass door and opened the curtain. The handprints were gone. Not just smeared or faded, completely gone. My stomach dropped as I realized the glass was pristine, like it had been cleaned. "I swear they were here," I stammered, pointing at where the handprints had been. "I saw them." The officers exchanged a glance. "We'll do another sweep of the area," one of them said, clearly skeptical. "In the meantime, keep your doors locked." After they left, I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the bed with Max, gripping a flashlight and a kitchen knife. Every shadow in the room felt like it was moving. Every sound felt amplified. I kept telling myself it was over, that the man had left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I called Rachel and begged her to come home early. I didn't care if she thought I was overreacting. I needed to get out of that house. She came back that afternoon, worried but unconvinced. I didn't bother explaining everything, just packed my bag and left as quickly as I could. Weeks later, Rachel called me, her voice shaky. She'd found muddy footprints leading from the backyard to the sliding glass door. And on the glass, faint but undeniable, were the same handprints I'd seen that night. I was 16 the first time I was left alone for an entire weekend. My parents were heading out to visit my grandmother, and I had declined to join them, eager for a bit of freedom. The house felt different the moment they left, though. Too quiet, too still. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The first night started off fine. I ordered pizza, played video games, and stayed up way too late scrolling through my phone. By the time I went to bed, it was almost 1 a.m. I turned off the lights, crawled under the covers, and let the silence of the house settle around me. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up, but something had pulled me out of my dreams. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the creaks of an old house settling. But then, I heard it again, a faint sound, like someone walking slowly, carefully, just outside my room. My breath caught in my throat. I lay completely still, straining to. The sound came again, a soft, deliberate creak. It was coming from the hallway. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. Mom? Dad? I called out, even though I knew it couldn't be them. No answer. The house was completely silent now. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight, and crept to the. My hand trembled as I unlocked it and pulled it over to crack. The hallway stretched out in front of me, bathed in shadow. Nothing moved. No one was there. I stepped out, every nerve in my body on high alert. The house felt colder than it had earlier, the kind of chill that seemed to seep into your bones. I checked every room upstairs, but everything was just as it should be. Feeling foolish, I went back to bed and forced myself to fall asleep. The next morning, I tried to laugh it off. I told myself it was probably my imagination, a mix of being alone for the first time and watching too many horror movies. But that night, it happened again. I had just turned off the lights and crawled into bed when I heard it, a soft creak, followed by another and another. It was the unmistakable sound of someone walking down the hall. This time, the footsteps didn't stop. They came closer and closer until they were right outside my door. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst. I stared at the door, waiting for it to open, for something, anything to happen. But the footsteps stopped, and the silence was deafening. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I got up and opened the door. The hallway was empty, just like the night before. I checked every room again, my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. Everything was in its place. No sign of anyone. But when I got back to my room, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The door to my closet, which I was certain I had closed earlier, was now slightly ajar. I stared at it, frozen in place. The darkness inside seemed to stretch forever, deeper than it should have been. I wanted to close it, to shut whatever was inside away, but I couldn't make myself move. Finally, I grabbed a baseball bat from under my bed and inched toward the closet. My hand shook as I reached out and yanked the door open. Nothing. It was empty, just my clothes hanging neatly on their hangers. I let out a shaky breath, feeling ridiculous. But as I turned to go back to bed, I noticed something on the inside of the closet door. Scratches, long, deep marks, as if someone or something had clawed at it from inside. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in bed, clutching the baseball bat, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. The next morning, I called my parents and asked when they'd be home. My mom laughed, saying I sounded like a little kid. I didn't tell her about the scratches. I didn't tell anyone. When they finally came back, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The house felt normal again, filled with the sound of voices and footsteps that I knew belonged to real people. But as I unpacked my bag and went to put something in the closet, I saw it again. The scratches. They were deeper now, as if whatever had made them was growing more desperate. I never stayed home alone after that, and to this day, I can't sleep unless every closet in the house is shut tight. It happened during a summer when I was 16. My parents had left for a weekend business trip, leaving me alone in our small two-story house on the edge of town. I wasn't the type to get scared easily, and I'd been left home alone before, so I didn't think much of it. But from the moment they drove away, something felt off. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it lounging around, watching TV, and texting my friends. By the time night fell, the house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I chalked it up to the house settling and brushed it off. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. It started with small noises, a faint tapping sound coming from downstairs. It was rhythmic, like someone lightly knocking on wood. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. My mind raced through logical explanations. It could be a tree branch against the window, or maybe the old pipes acting up. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I crept down the stairs. The tapping had stopped by the time I reached the living room. I checked the windows and the doors, all locked. Satisfied, I returned to bed, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then, around 2 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it wasn't tapping. It was a faint scraping sound, like metal against metal. My stomach churned as I realized it was coming from the kitchen. Clutching my phone like a lifeline, I slowly made my way downstairs. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure it would give me away. As I reached the kitchen, I froze. The back door, the one I was certain I had locked, was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the night breeze. I stared at it, my mind blank with fear. Someone had been in the house. Maybe they still were. I wanted to run, to call for help, but my body refused to move. Instead, I forced myself to close the door and lock it again. I checked every corner of the house, every closet, every shadow. Nothing. Whoever had opened that door was gone. The next morning, I called my mom and told her about it. She dismissed it as me forgetting to lock the door, but I knew better. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every little sound. By the time night fell again, I was a nervous wreck. Around midnight, I heard it, the scraping sound again. This time, it was coming from upstairs. I grabbed a kitchen knife and made my way up, every step feeling like an eternity. The sound grew louder as I approached my bedroom. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife. When I pushed open the door, my heart nearly stopped. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the wind. On the floor beneath it was a small, rusted crowbar. I slammed the window shut and locked it, my mind racing. Someone had been in my room. They'd left that crowbar behind. But why? Were they trying to scare me? Or had they planned something worse? I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the corner of my room with the knife in one hand and my phone in the other, my eyes glued to the door. Every creak of the house felt like a footstep. Every gust of wind felt like a whisper. By morning, I was exhausted but alive. My parents came home that afternoon, and I told them everything. My dad checked the house, but there was no sign of forced entry, no sign of anyone breaking in. The crowbar was the only evidence, and even that seemed to baffle him. To this day, I don't know who was in the house that weekend or what they wanted, but sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that faint tapping sound, like a warning that they'll be back. It happened 3 years ago when I was 17. My parents had gone out of town for a wedding, leaving me home alone for the week. At first, I was thrilled. 2 whole days to myself, no one to tell me what to do, and an excuse to binge-watch horror movies without anyone rolling their eyes. Our house was in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. At night, it could get unnervingly silent, with only the occasional sound of a coyote howling in the distance or branches brushing against the windows. I wasn't scared of being alone, though. I'd grown up in that house, and I knew it like the back of my hand. The first night passed uneventfully. I stayed up late watching movies and munching on snacks, finally falling asleep on the couch around 1 a.m. The next morning, I woke up to find everything just as I'd left it. I let myself relax, thinking the weekend would be easy. But that night, something changed. I had just finished watching another horror movie and was cleaning up the living room when I heard it. A faint knock. It was so soft that at first, I thought I'd imagined it. I paused, listening. There it was again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze, my heart pounding. It was coming from the front door. I walked to the door cautiously, peeking through the peephole. There was no one there. The porch light illuminated the empty front yard, the quiet street beyond. I opened the door just a crack and called out, "Hello?" Nothing, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I shut the door and locked it, trying to shake off the unease. It was probably just kids playing a prank, I told myself. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. A few hours later, I was in bed, scrolling through my phone. The house was silent, and the woods outside were pitch black. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it again. 3 knocks. This time, they weren't at the front door. They were coming from the back door. My blood ran cold. The back door led to the deck, which was surrounded by the woods. No one should be out there. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping down the stairs. The knocking stopped as I approached the kitchen. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the light switch. When I finally flicked it on, I saw it. On the glass of the back door, just above the lock, were smudges, handprints. They were faint but unmistakable, as if someone had pressed their palms against the glass and dragged them down slowly. My breath caught in my throat. I checked the lock. It was secure. Whoever had been knocking couldn't have gotten in, but the thought of someone standing on the deck, watching me through the glass, made my skin crawl. I closed the curtains and retreated to the living room, turning on every light I could. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. By dawn, I was exhausted but relieved that the night had passed without further incident. The next evening, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the handprints had been there all along, and I'd just noticed them. Maybe the knocking was just some animal brushing against the door. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. As night fell, the sense of unease returned. I double-checked every door and window, making sure they were locked. Then, I sat in the living room with the TV on, trying to distract myself. Around midnight, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and the silence was deafening. My phone's flashlight became my only source of light as I fumbled around, trying to find candles. That's when I heard it again. 3 knocks. This time, they came from the window right behind me. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam of light landed on the window, and my heart stopped. A face was staring back at me. It was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into me. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the light. It just stood there, its face pressed against the glass. I screamed, stumbling back and dropping the flashlight. When I scrambled to pick it up and aimed it at the window again, The face was gone. I ran to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife I could find, and called the police with shaking hands. When they arrived, they found no one. No footprints outside, no sign of forced entry, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew I wasn't imagining it. That was the last night I ever stayed home alone. To this day, I can't look out a window at night without feeling like something or someone is looking back at me. It was the summer before my freshman year of college, and my parents had gone on a 2-week cruise to celebrate their anniversary. They asked if I wanted to go, but I declined. I was looking forward to having the house to myself, a break from their constant hovering, and a chance to enjoy some freedom. The first few days were uneventful. I slept in, binge-watched TV shows, and ate junk food without anyone commenting. By the fifth night, the novelty was wearing off, and I started to notice how unnervingly quiet the house could get when I was alone. It wasn't the kind of silence I was used to. It felt heavy, like the house was listening, watching. That night, I stayed up late, scrolling through my phone in bed. The house was completely dark, except for the glow of my screen. Around 1 a.m., I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from downstairs. It was so subtle that at first I thought it might be the wind outside, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was coming from inside the house. I froze, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, a soft shuffling like footsteps across the hardwood floor. My first thought was that my parents had come back early, but that didn't make sense. They would have called. Grabbing my phone, I tiptoed to my bedroom door and pressed my ear against it. The footsteps were unmistakable now, moving slowly, deliberately through the living room. My heart was pounding in my chest as I unlocked the door as quietly as I could and peeked out into the hallway. The upstairs was dark and still, but the faint glow of the nightlight in the hallway illuminated the top of the staircase. I could see shadows shifting below, faint but deliberate movements that didn't belong to anyone I knew. My first instinct was to call the police, but then I thought, what if it's nothing? What if it's just the house settling, or I left a window open and the wind is moving things around? I didn't want to embarrass myself by overreacting. I decided to investigate, telling myself I'd feel better once I saw there was nothing there. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept in my closet and started down the stairs, one step at a time. The closer I got to the bottom, the more I could hear the faint creak of floorboards, the soft rustle of something being moved. When I reached the living room, I found it empty. Nothing was out of place. The windows were shut, the doors locked. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a mix of relief and embarrassment. I was just being paranoid. But as I turned to go back upstairs, I noticed something strange. The hallway leading to the kitchen seemed darker than usual, like the light from the living room couldn't quite reach it. And in that darkness, I could hear something, breathing. My blood ran cold. I gripped the bat tighter, my hands slick with sweat. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The breathing stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, from the darkness, a voice, a low, guttural whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled back, my heart racing. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, growing taller, denser, like they were alive. I turned and ran up the stairs, slamming my bedroom door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely dial 911. The operator stayed on the line with me as I explained what had happened. I didn't mention the voice. I wasn't sure they'd believe me. Instead, I said, I thought someone had broken in. They told me to stay in my room and wait for the police. I stayed pressed against the door, the bat in one hand and my phone in the other. Minutes felt like hours. Every creak of the house made me jump. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens, and the police searched the house but found no sign of anyone. No forced entry, no footprints, nothing. They told me it was probably my imagination or the wind playing tricks on me, but I knew what I'd heard. And when I went back downstairs the next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. On the kitchen floor, just beyond where the shadows had gathered, was a single wet footprint. It was too large to be mine and looked like it had been made by someone or something barefoot. I never told my parents the full story when they came back. They would have just laughed it off or said I was watching too many horror movies, but I never stayed in that house alone again. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in the darkness that night is still out there, waiting. The night it happened started like any other. My parents were out at a late-night party, and I was left home alone. It was a Saturday, and I planned to spend the evening playing video games in the comfort of our living room. Our house wasn't particularly large, but it felt big enough when you were the only one in it. Around 10 p.m., as I was immersed in my game, the power flickered. It came back on almost immediately, but it was enough to pull me out of the zone. I paused the game and glanced around. The living room felt unusually quiet, even for our normally peaceful neighborhood. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the wind outside, and went back to playing. About 15 minutes later, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the game's soundtrack, but it grew louder. A soft thud like something had bumped against a wall. I froze, my hands hovering over the controller. It came again, this time from upstairs. I muted the TV and listened, my heart starting to race. The sound didn't repeat and the house fell silent again. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling or maybe something falling over in my room. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that was creeping over. I decided to check it out. Grabbing the flashlight my dad kept by the front door, I made my way upstairs, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The hallway was dimly lit by the nightlight plugged into the wall, casting long, eerie shadows. I checked my room first, then the bathroom and my parents' room. Nothing was out of place. I was about to head back downstairs when I noticed something strange. The door to the attic, the one at the end of the hallway, was slightly ajar. We rarely used the attic, and I was certain it had been closed earlier. My stomach dropped as I stared at it, half expecting something to emerge from the darkness beyond. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I walked toward the door. The flashlight beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the narrow staircase that led up to the attic. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, debating whether to go up. Finally, I decided to close the door and lock it. I'd tell my dad about it in the morning. As I turned to leave, I heard it. Soft, almost imperceptible breathing. It was coming from the attic. My blood ran cold. I bolted down the hallway and back to the living room, locking myself in. My heart was pounding and I couldn't think straight. I wanted to call the police, but what would I even say? That I thought I heard someone breathing in my attic? As I sat there clutching the flashlight, I realized something. The breathing hadn't sounded human. It was too shallow, too raspy, like the wheeze of something trying too hard to inhale. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. I jumped to my feet, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. I backed away toward the front door, my mind racing. Should I run? Should I call for help? Then, I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, coming down the hallway toward the stairs. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the staircase, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I could hear the floorboards creaking under the weight of whatever was coming. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. For a moment, everything was silent. Then a low growl, deep, guttural, and inhuman, echoed through the house. I didn't wait to see what it was. I yanked open the front door and ran, sprinting down the driveway and into the street. I didn't stop until I was halfway to my neighbor's house. I banged on their door until they answered, breathless and terrified, and told them someone or something was in my house. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. They searched the house and found no signs of forced entry. The attic was empty, save for a few dusty old boxes. The officers assured me that I was probably just imagining things, but I knew better. I knew what I had heard. My parents came home shortly after, and I told them what had happened. They laughed it off, saying I'd probably had too much caffeine or watched too many scary movies, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in the attic hadn't left. It was still there, waiting. That night, I slept in my neighbor's guest room with the lights on, and even now, years later, I can't bring myself to go into an attic without feeling that same icy dread creeping over me. Whatever I heard that night wasn't human. Of that, I'm certain. It happened on a rainy autumn night, the kind of night where the sound of the wind howling through the trees and the relentless patter of raindrops on the windows creates a strange symphony. My parents were out of town visiting relatives, leaving me alone in our creaky, old two-story house. I wasn't particularly scared of being alone. I'd done it plenty of times before, but something about that night felt different. The air was heavy, and the house seemed darker than usual. I was curled up on the couch, binge-watching a series with a bowl of popcorn in my lap, when I first heard it. A faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was the rain against the window, but it was too rhythmic. It came in a pattern. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. I muted the TV and listened, my pulse quickening. The sound was coming from the front door. I sat there frozen, debating whether I should check it out. It was late, almost midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Finally, I grabbed my phone and cautiously approached the door. The tapping stopped as I got closer. I peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. The porch was empty, the only movement coming from the swaying of the trees in the wind. I opened the door a crack and called out, "Hello?" No answer. I closed the door, locked it, and tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself, or maybe some neighborhood kids playing a prank. I went back to the couch, but the sense of unease lingered. About an hour later, as I was finally starting to relax, I heard it again. The same pattern of tapping, 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. But this time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the back door. My stomach dropped. Our back door faced the woods, and there was no reason anyone should be back there, especially not at this hour. Gripping my phone tightly, I crept toward the kitchen, where the back door was located. The tapping stopped just as I reached it. Through the glass pane of the door, I could see the outline of the deck and the woods beyond. Everything looked normal, until I noticed something. The porch light, which should have been on, was flickering. It cast strange shadows across the deck, making it hard to see clearly. I stood there for a moment, staring out into the darkness, when something moved. It was subtle, just a shift in the shadows, but enough to make my heart race. I locked the deadbolt and backed away, my breathing shallow. I decided to call the police, even though I felt ridiculous. What would I even say? That I thought I saw something in the shadows? Before I could dial, my phone vibrated in my hand. It was a text message. The number was unknown, and the message read, "Why did you lock the door?" I felt the blood drain from my face. My hand shook as I reread the message, hoping I'd misinterpreted it. But no, it was clear. Someone knew I'd locked the back door. A second message came through. "I can see you." I dropped the phone and stumbled back, my mind racing. How could they see me? Were they watching me through a window? I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a kitchen knife, and ran to the living room, where the curtains were. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't pick it up. The house felt suffocatingly silent. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, made me jump. I didn't dare move, clutching the knife tightly as I sat on the couch, trying to control my breathing. Then, I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. My heart stopped. I was certain I'd locked all the doors and windows, but somehow, someone was inside the house. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear the faint creak of the stairs, as whoever or whatever it was descended. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I stared at the doorway, waiting for something to appear. And then, the lights went. I was plunged into darkness, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to use the flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I felt it. A presence. Someone was in the room with me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as a low, guttural whisper filled the air. "Why don't you answer your phone?" I screamed and bolted for the door, flinging it open and running out into the rain-soaked night. I didn't stop until I reached my neighbor's house, banging on their door until they let me in. The police arrived shortly after, but when they searched my house, they found no one. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. But when I went back to the living room to collect my things, I found my phone on the couch, where I'd left it. The screen was cracked, and a new text message was displayed. "You can't run forever." I moved out of that house shortly after. To this day, I don't know who or what was tormenting me that night, but I do know one thing. I'm never staying home alone again. It started as an ordinary night. I had just moved into my first apartment, a cozy little place tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. I had everything set up, my couch, my bed, a few pictures on the walls. The neighbors were friendly and the building itself was older but well maintained. I had no reason to be afraid. That was until the noises started. At first, it was subtle, soft scratching sounds in the walls that I dismissed as the house settling or maybe some critter running through the pipes. But then, it became more distinct. I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone walking across the floor in the apartment above mine. The thing was, no one lived above me. The landlord had told me the unit had been vacant for months. I tried to ignore it. I was alone, still getting used to living on my own, and the last thing I wanted to do was jump to conclusions. But every night the sounds grew louder. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and listen to those steps. They were always at the same time, right around midnight. Slow, deliberate footsteps, followed by a faint scraping, like furniture being moved or dragged across the floor. It was hard to ignore after a while. It felt like someone was right above me, and I couldn't do anything about it. One evening, around 11:30 p.m., I decided I had enough. I grabbed my phone and texted the landlord, asking if he could come over to take a look at the apartment above me. Maybe there was an issue with the pipes, or maybe it was just a fluke. He replied almost immediately, saying he'd check it out in the morning. But that night, the noises were worse than ever. I was sitting on the couch, trying to distract myself with a movie, when I heard a loud crash from above. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, something like a bookshelf or a table. My heart raced as I stood up and walked to the door. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob, the dread building inside me. I opened the door to find the hallway empty. There were no other doors on my floor, just a narrow corridor that led to the stairs. I made my way upstairs, my footsteps echoing as I climbed. At the top of the stairs, I knocked on the door to the empty apartment. There was no answer. I was about to turn around and leave when I noticed something strange, a faint glow coming from under the door. It wasn't bright, but it was enough to catch my attention. It flickered, like a candle, but the light was far too steady to be from a normal flame. My breath caught in my throat. I knocked again, harder this time. No response. I didn't know what came over me, but I twisted the doorknob. To my surprise, the door wasn't locked. It creaked open slowly, and I stepped into the dark apartment. The glow was coming from the center of the room, where an old, worn armchair sat in the middle of the floor. On the chair was a lit candle, surrounded by a circle of what looked like chalk marking, strange symbols I couldn't recognize. The air was thick with the scent of something metallic, like blood. I felt my stomach turn. I backed away, my mind racing. I turned to leave, but before I could get to the door, I heard it. The softest sound, like a whisper. It came from behind me. I froze. The voice wasn't clear, but it sounded almost familiar, like someone I knew. I turned around, heart in my throat, and for a split second, I saw a shadow move across the floor. I blinked, and it was gone. I ran out of the apartment and down the stairs, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone. I called the landlord and told him everything. He promised he would send someone over in the morning to investigate, but I couldn't stay there. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in that apartment, waiting. The next day, the landlord arrived with a maintenance worker. I told them about the candle, the symbols, the shadow. They found the apartment exactly as I'd described it, except for one thing. There was no candle, no symbols, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The landlord apologized, telling me it was probably just an old, drafty building playing tricks on me, but I couldn't forget the look on the maintenance worker's face when he inspected the floor. He didn't say anything, but he seemed shaken, and I noticed him glance nervously at the walls. That night, I moved out. I don't know who or what was in that apartment, but I do know this. Whatever it was waiting for someone to find it. And when I left, it wasn't done with me. To this day, I still hear the footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from above me. But now, I know better than to listen. I keep my back to the wall, my eyes on the door, and I never look up. I had just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to some much-needed alone time in my apartment. My parents were out of town, and I had the place to myself for the weekend. The evening was calm, and the rain outside had created a perfect setting for a quiet night in. I made myself some dinner, sat down on the couch with a glass of wine, and turned on the TV to unwind. It wasn't until about 10 p.m. that things started to feel off. I had just finished watching an episode of a show when I heard it, the sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. It was faint at first, like someone walking around, but it was enough to catch my attention. I lived on the ground floor of a two-story building, and no one lived above me, or at least that's what I thought. I paused the show, straining to listen. The footsteps continued soft but steady, pacing back and forth. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just the building settling, perhaps the wind making the walls creak. But the sound kept going, and it was too rhythmic, too deliberate to ignore. After a few minutes, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my phone and cautiously made my way to the stairs. But as soon as I reached the bottom step, the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was unsettling. I stood there for a moment, my breath shallow, trying to decide whether I should go up and check. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard a soft scraping noise from above. It sounded like something was being dragged across the floor. My heart raced, but I forced myself to climb the stairs. I reached the second floor and walked down the hall to the only other door in the building, the door to the attic. It was old and wooden, with a brass handle that felt cold to the touch. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a faint light flickering from inside. I hesitated, my mind racing with questions. No one had been up there in ages, or so I thought. My parents had always kept the attic locked, but now it seemed different. There was something off about the flickering light, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The attic was small, filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and forgotten trinkets. The flickering light came from a single candle sitting on an old wooden table, its flame dancing wildly in the still air. But what struck me as most strange was the floor. The space beneath the candle was completely clean, as if the dust had been swept away, forming a perfect circle around the table. As I took a step forward, I heard a voice, a whisper, coming from the corner of the room. My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't clear, but it sounded like it was coming from someone or something right behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the candle flickered and went out, plunging the attic into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel my legs shaking. But I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the room. But when I pointed the light toward the corner where the voice had come from, there was nothing. I backed out of the attic quickly, my breath coming in short gasps. As I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow. It was standing in the doorway, blocking my way out. I froze. The shadow was tall, its form shifting in the dim light from my phone. It didn't have any distinct features, just a dark, solid figure that seemed to absorb the light around it. I could feel the weight of its presence, the air growing colder with every passing second. Without thinking, I bolted down the stairs and out of the apartment, running into the rain-soaked night. I didn't stop until I reached a nearby cafe, where I sat and tried to catch my breath. When I went back to the apartment the next day, everything seemed normal. The attic door was closed, the candle was nowhere to be found, and there was no sign of anything unusual. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination or maybe a trick of the light. But as I lay in bed that night, trying to forget the terrifying experience, I heard something again. Soft, slow footsteps walking across the floor above me. I knew I wasn't alone. I haven't gone back to that apartment since. It's been months now, and I still hear the footsteps wherever I am. The sound haunts me, following me wherever I go. The thing in the attic, it's still there, and it's waiting. I had been living in my new apartment for just a few weeks when I started to notice things weren't quite right. It was an older building, the kind with creaky floors and drafty windows, and though it was charming in its own way, there was something unsettling about it. I'd put it down to the normal discomfort of adjusting to a new place, but after a while, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. It began with strange noises. At night, when the apartment was supposed to be quiet, I would hear what sounded like whispers, soft, indistinct voices murmuring from behind the walls. At first, I thought it was just the pipes or the building settling, but as the days went by, the whispers became more pronounced, as if they were trying to get my attention. I tried to ignore them, but the whispers were persistent. Every night, they seemed to grow louder. The worst part was that they sounded so close, like someone was standing just behind, speaking in low, hushed. I'd spin around, but the room would be empty. I decided to talk to my neighbor, an older woman who had lived in the building for years. She was kind and understanding, and when I mentioned the strange noises, she nodded knowingly. "It's not just you," she said. "This building, it's got a history. People say it's haunted." Her words sent a chill down my spine. She didn't elaborate much further, but I could tell she believed it. Her eyes darted to the door as if she was afraid someone might overhear us. I brushed it off as superstition at first, thinking she was just trying to spook me. But as the days passed, I became more aware of the strange, unsettling things that started happening. Objects would be out of place, as though someone had moved them when I wasn't looking. My keys would be missing, only to turn up in a completely different spot. The worst part was the feeling that I was being watched. I would sometimes glance over my shoulder and feel a cold, heavy gaze on my back. One evening, while I was sitting at my desk working, the air in the room grew colder. I noticed it immediately, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep in from the walls. I shivered and pulled my blanket tighter around me, but it didn't help. The temperature kept dropping. I stood up to adjust the thermostat, but before I could reach it, the lights flickered. Then, the whispers started again. They were louder this time, clearer. I could hear words now, though they didn't make sense. It was like a jumble of voices all speaking at once, creating an eerie, overlapping chorus. I froze, feeling my heartbeat quicken. The whispers weren't just coming from the walls anymore. They were coming from everywhere. They were all around me. I turned to the door, my instincts telling me to run. But as I reached for the doorknob, the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an unnatural silence in their wake. My fingers hovered over the door, and I felt something cold brush against my skin, like a hand grazing my arm. I spun around, but the room was empty. The whispers had ceased, and all that was left was the oppressive silence. The temperature was still freezing, but I could no longer hear the faint hum of the refrigerator or the outside traffic noise. It was as if the world had been muffled, leaving only the sound of my racing pulse. I left the apartment the next morning and went straight to the landlord, demanding to know more about the history of the building. She was tight-lipped at first, but eventually told me there had been strange reports from tenants. Some said they'd heard voices, others claimed to see shadows moving when no one was around. The most disturbing story was about a previous tenant, an artist who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. No one knew what had happened to her, but some believed she'd gone mad in that apartment, convinced that something was watching her. After hearing this, I knew I couldn't stay. I started packing my things, deciding to find another place to live. But as I was packing up the kitchen, I heard a knock at the door. I opened it, but no one was there. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I noticed something. A piece of paper had been slipped under the door. I bent down and picked it up, feeling my heart race as I read the words scrawled in jagged handwriting. "You can't leave. We won't let you leave." My hands trembled as I dropped the note, my pulse pounding in my ears. It was the final straw. I packed up the rest of my things and left the apartment that same never looked back. To this day, I don't know who or what was haunting that apartment, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it didn't want me to leave. It wasn't just the building that was haunted. It was something inside it, something waiting for its next victim. I haven't gone near that part of town since. The whispers still echo in my mind, and sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear them calling my name. It had been a quiet week, and I was finally getting used to the solitude of my new house. It was a small, modest place located just outside of town. I'd bought it on a whim, tired of the noise and chaos of the city. The house had charm, with its old wooden floors and faded wallpaper, but there was an underlying eeriness to it that I couldn't shake. The air always felt just a little too still, like something was holding its breath. One night, after a long day at work, I came home to find the house colder than usual. I chalked it up to the old furnace, which I'd been meaning to have checked, but the chill seemed to have seeped into every room. I turned on the heat, grabbed a blanket, and settled on the couch with a book, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling gnawing at me. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping like fingernails scratching against wood. It was faint at first, coming from somewhere above me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I lived alone. There was no one else in the house. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe a mouse scurrying in the walls, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the attic. I stood up and made my way to the attic door, my heart thudding in my chest. The door was old, the wood warped with age, and the rusty handle was cold to the touch. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob, but I couldn't ignore the sound. I had to know what it was. I pulled open the door, and a gust of cold air rushed past me. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the small window. I grabbed a flashlight and scanned the room. The attic was filled with old furniture and boxes covered in dust and cobweb. There was nothing unusual at first glance, but the tapping had stopped. I let out a breath, relieved, but then I noticed something strange. In the corner of the room, there was a rocking chair. It was old, the wood cracked and faded, but it was rocking slowly, back and forth, as though someone had just been sitting in it. I froze. I hadn't touched the chair. In fact, I hadn't even seen it before. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe the house had settled. Maybe there was a draft pushing it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Suddenly, I heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it was closer, right behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the cold air. I backed out of the attic, my pulse racing, and slammed the door shut. I didn't sleep that night. The tapping continued, growing louder and more frantic. It felt like the house was alive, like something was trying to get my attention, to make me listen. The next day, I called a friend, hoping to distract myself from the strange happenings. I told him about the tapping, the chair, and how it all felt wrong. He suggested I check the history of the house, maybe see if there were any previous owners who had experienced similar things. I hadn't thought of that, but it seemed like a good idea. I went to the local library and asked the librarian if she knew anything about the house. She hesitated before pulling up a file. As she handed it to me, she gave me a strange look. "Be careful," she said softly. "Some houses have a way of holding on to things that don't want to be forgotten." I opened the file and read through it. The house had been built in the early 1900s, but the most unsettling part was what had happened in the 1920s. A family had lived there, husband, wife, and their young daughter. One day, the husband disappeared, leaving behind only a note. The wife was never seen again either, and the daughter, she was found alone in the house, crying, her clothes torn, her eyes wide with terror. The girl had never spoken again after that day. I went home that night, my mind racing with thoughts of the family who had lived there before me. I stood in front of the attic door, hand trembling on the knob. I knew what I had to do. I opened it. The room was colder than ever, the air thick with the scent of dust and something else, something metallic. The rocking chair was still there, still moving, but now it was joined by something else, a small figure standing in the far corner. It was a girl. She was tiny, no more than 8 years old, with long, tangled hair and clothes that were torn and dirty. She was staring at me, her eyes wide and unblinking. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I stood frozen in place as she slowly raised her hand, pointing directly at me. And then the tapping started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the floor, from beneath my feet. I looked down. The floorboards were creaking, shifting, as though something was moving beneath them, trying to break through. I backed away, but the girl's eyes followed me, her expression blank. The tapping grew louder, faster, and I realized with horror that the thing beneath the floor wasn't just trying to escape. It was coming for me. I ran out of the house, slamming the door behind me. I didn't look back. I don't know what happened in that house, but I do know that it wasn't just the memories of the past that were trapped there. Whatever was beneath the floor, whatever had been haunting the house, was still there, waiting, and it didn't want to be forgotten. It was a calm, rainy night when I first moved into the old farmhouse. I had been searching for a place to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, and this house seemed perfect. Isolated, surrounded by trees, with a simple, rustic charm that promised peace and solitude. My friends had warned me about it, stories of strange happenings, people hearing voices in the night, but I brushed it off as just local gossip. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time unpacking and getting settled, enjoying the quiet that enveloped the house. But as the days wore on, I began to notice small things out of place. The kitchen faucet would be turned on when I was sure I had shut it off. Doors would creak open on their own, and lights would flicker. At first, I told myself it was just old plumbing or faulty wiring, but as the odd occurrences continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It all started one evening when I was sitting in the living room. I heard a faint tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was just the rain, but the sound persisted. Tap, tap, tap. I stood up and went over to the window, peering outside into the dark, rain-soaked yard. There was no one there. I shrugged it off and went back to my book, but the tapping continued. It was louder now, coming from the window behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but once again, there was nothing, no one, just the sound of rain. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I heard it again. The tapping was now coming from the door to the basement. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic and deliberate, like someone trying to get my attention. My instincts told me to ignore it, but I couldn't. I had to see what it was. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the basement door. The air in the hallway felt thick, heavy. My breath was shallow, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I reached for the doorknob and opened it. The basement was pitch dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. I hesitated, but then I heard it. Footsteps, soft but distinct, moving slowly in the dark. My heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I stepped down into the basement, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The air was cold, and the dampness of the space made my skin crawl. The beam of light flickered as I swept it across the room, landing on old crates, rusted tools, and piles of forgotten junk. There was no one there, but the tapping continued. I followed the sound, my feet moving slowly, cautiously. It led me to the far corner of the basement, where an old, weathered door stood. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed out of place. It wasn't part of the house's original design, and the wood around the frame looked as though it had been patched up, covered over time. The tapping was louder now, almost frantic. My heart hammered in my chest as I reached for the doorknob. It was cold to the touch, and when I twisted it, the door creaked open with a deep, groaning sound. Beyond it was another room, but this one was different from the rest of the house. The air was stale, and the walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn hastily in what looked like blood. I stepped inside, my flashlight illuminating the room. The walls were lined with old wooden shelves, some empty, some holding strange objects, jars of what I couldn't identify, old books, a mirror. The mirror was the strangest thing of all. It wasn't like any mirror I'd ever seen before. The frame was dark, almost black, with intricate carvings of twisted, gnarled faces, and the reflection, it wasn't mine. For a moment, I thought I was just seeing things, but then the reflection in the mirror began to move on its own, as if it was separate from me. The figure in the mirror smiled at me, but it wasn't my smile. It was something darker. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't look away. The reflection in the mirror reached out, its hand pressing against the glass. I could feel it. It was as if it were calling to me, pulling me in. Suddenly, the tapping started again, but this time, it was coming from behind me, not from the mirror. I whipped around, but there was nothing. The room was empty. Yet, the sound persisted, now louder, closer. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was racing, my breath shallow. I ran up the stairs, not stopping until I reached the safety of my bedroom. That night, I couldn't sleep. The tapping never stopped. It came from the walls, the floor, the doors, everywhere. It followed me, always just out of sight, growing louder as the hours passed. The next morning, I packed my things and left the farmhouse. I didn't care about the house or the land anymore. I couldn't stay there, not after what I'd seen. I still don't know what it was. The mirror, the tapping, the strange symbols, whatever it was, it followed me. To this day, I can hear the tapping sometimes late at night when I'm alone. It's faint, but it's there. And I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't part of the house. It was something older, something far more ancient, and it's still out there, waiting for the next person to come along. Maybe you'll be the next one.